Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. I've learned something interesting during the course of this debate and over the last few days, and that is that according to the Minister for Workplace Relations and Safety, pay rises in the public sector are a bad thing. He believes that pay rises in the public sector are a bad thing, according to Minister Woodhouse. This came up when the National Party's pet blogger, David Farrar, started blogging around the issues of connecting MPs' pay to the public sector salaries. And in particular, he identified that there were periods in time in recent history where MPs' pay rises would have been higher had they been tagged to the pay increases that the public sector got. And the minister turned around and said, well, that was all Labor's fault. That was the result of a profligate Labor government that seemed to believe in this bizarre notion that nurses and doctors and teachers and the Defence Force and the police force deserve a pay rise. And that this was somehow a bad idea, that these people should be paid a reasonable wage for the work that they do. Of course, one of the things which is important to note about a lot of those professions is they're quite heavily unionised, which means these are people who have got, I don't know whether or not that means the National Party thinks they're bad people, but it does mean that they've got the strength of collective bargaining. So if some of those groups did well in their bargaining, so teachers, according to Paul Foster Bell, teachers are union thugs. The police are union thugs. Firefighters are union thugs. Nurses are union thugs. That is the language we get from the National Party. Even the quiet little church mouse, Paul Foster Bell, calls nurses union thugs. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That's the approach that we get from the National Party. So the fact that these unionised workforces were able to negotiate for themselves good pay rises and the fact that the National Party thinks that was a bad thing, I think gives us some insight into some of the employment relations legislation changes that we've seen over the last few years, deliberately designed to suppress wages by curtailing the influence and the bargaining power of the unions. So that I think tells us a lot about what the National Party thinks about the public sector getting pay rises. Sir, Paula, I simply quoted your own member back to you. I can't exaggerate his words. I can't exaggerate his words. He told me what he thought. He told me what he thought, and I repeated those words back to him. I would hardly call that ramping it up. Sir, this bill does seek to do a good thing. The problem is the mechanism that it uses is poor, and the process that has been used to bring this legislation before the House is extremely poor. This is an issue that's been around for a long time. As soon as John Key became the Prime Minister, one of the first things I remember him talking about is the issue of MPs' pay rises and the issue of them potentially being disproportionate when compared to the pay increases that he expected ordinary working people, people who depend on work to make a living, would actually be able to get in New Zealand. So he's had 6 years, getting on 7 years, to do something about this issue. But the latest round of pay increases obviously didn't do very well in the polling. When David Farrar went out there and did the polling, when they ran the focus groups over the weekend, clearly there was a significant backlash from the public around the latest pay increase. And so they felt they had to do something. So after the Sunday afternoon focus group, quickly they ran off to the officials and got a draft bill organised, and it was quickly introduced to the House. As we know, that draft bill was then sort of left on the table for a while as all the issues with it were sorted out, and the National Party went back to the officials and tried to figure out how to do this properly without a proper process where we actually hear from, as Chris Hipkins said, the Remuneration Authority. I would actually genuinely like to know, has the Minister consulted with the Remuneration Authority? And for that matter, matter, who else has the Minister consulted with about this? What outside advice has the Minister actually sought in order, Mr Chairman?
Lees-Galloway.
What outside advice has the Minister actually sought in order to get this legislation as right as possible, given that it won't go to Select Committee? We are not giving the officials the proper length of time to actually closely examine this legislation and make sure that it is fit for purpose, given that the public have no opportunity to come and give us their view on this legislation, given that organisations like the Remuneration Authority have no opportunity to come to Select Committee and give us their view to make sure this legislation is fit for purpose. We've had experience in this House under this government of rushed legislation in the past, and we've had the experience of having to come back to the House and sort it out and make it right. And there are a number of ways in which members in the House tonight have questioned the mechanism that is being used. And I would like to turn to the Green Party's SOPs, as Chris Hipkins has outlined, the fact that they, because the legislation in its final form arrived late, the SOPs then came after that, and we really haven't had time to consider them. And I take James Shaw's sort of Wheel of Fortune approach. I appreciate his view that, you know, we're taking a bit of a gamble on the government's legislation. Why not take a gamble on the Greens? And the simple fact is the government does have the machinery of government behind it. It has the best opportunity to get this right. And actually, we in the Labour Party, we were looking at some similar SOPs, particularly around the labour cost index. I think we were going in the same direction as what the Greens were, and we decided, you know, we didn't want to muddle the process any more than it already was, and we were going to have to rely on the government and their superb officials who have been put under a lot of pressure to try and get this legislation right. That is the benefit of being in government. You have the whole operation behind you to get these things right. We don't have the same level of support in opposition. So we will take our gamble on the government's legislation. We suspect, though, as I'm sure the Green members suspect, that although this might be a step in the right direction, we're going to be back looking at this again sometime in the near future. So the fact is that the reason there is so much discontent out in the general public about what MPs get paid is because essentially people who work for a living have been under a pay freeze for the last 6 years. As costs have gone up, many of those costs driven by decisions made by this government when they cut taxes for the extremely wealthy and put GST up and put the petrol tax up and put ACC levies up so that they could achieve a phony surplus. All of those things are driving costs up for working people. Meanwhile, they're not seeing their wages go up at the same rate. And that's where the distress about MPs' pay actually comes from. So if this government wants to do something about the things that are driving people's concerns about MPs' pay, they would actually have a laser-like focus on ensuring that people who work for a living, who are on median wages, actually saw some progress, actually felt as though they were getting ahead in life, actually felt as though their wages and salaries were sufficient to make ends meet, to pay the bills, to put a roof over their head, to feed their children, and to try and get ahead in life. If the government had a focus on those things, we probably wouldn't have to be here debating this legislation tonight, sir. So I agree that actually tagging our wages to what the general working population gets would be a good incentive for us to have our focus in the right place. And I think we will be back having a look at mechanisms like that sometime in the future. Sir, this is a step in the right direction as a response to the outrage cried out by the New Zealand public, but it is legislation by focus group. It's rushed, it's muddled, and my fear is that it's going to be just another mistake on this path, and we're going to be back trying to fix it up again in the future.
Mr. Chairman, I call